studying Act 1, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure for A-level and keen to gain an even better understanding and insight into the text, you're in the right place. Just make sure that you've read the scene in full and thought about it before watching any further. But stay tuned, this is Schofield on Shakespeare.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
Time for my summary of the scene. It begins with Lucio, who fancies himself as something of a joker in conversation with two gentlemen about current affairs. They seem to think that the Duke may have left the country in order to negotiate terms with the King of Hungary, with war a possible outcome. The men seem keen for war, presumably as an enterprise in which they can earn their keep. The conversation shifts to risque puns about sexually transmitted diseases, which each says the other has. Mistress Overdone, the manager of a local brothel, enters. Jokes about sexually transmitted diseases persist, although Mistress Overdone is in a more serious mood. She reports that Claudio has been arrested and sentenced to death for getting a woman called Juliet pregnant. Lucio and the two gentlemen head off to try to find out more about what has happened. Pompey, a servant to Mistress Overdone, is the next to enter, and he confirms the shocking news that Claudio has been whisked off unceremoniously to prison. Overall, the tone remains flippant, with gleeful bawdy quips in evidence. Yet Mistress Overdone is clearly worried about the future of her business, especially when she learns that Angelo intends to demolish all the brothels within the suburbs. Claudio then enters with the provost, a man responsible for catching and punishing criminals. En route to prison, he reflects on the arguably arbitrary way in which he has been punished for his actions, although he does not complain. He seems fatalistic. It is human nature to be self-destructive. However, he points out that his sexual act was entirely consensual and that he and Juliet had a formal verbal agreement to marry in place before the consummation of their relationship. He wonders whether Angelo may be enjoying power a little too much. Vienna's laws on fornication have not been enacted for 19 years. However, there is some hope for Claudio. His trainee nun sister Isabella may be able to help him, and so he asks Lucio to tell her what has happened and persuade her to use her skills to persuade Angelo to spare his life. Lucio agrees. He feels it rather a shame that a man could lose his life just following a simple game of consensual sex. Here are some questions for you to consider. I would recommend pausing the video in a moment to write some detailed paragraphs of your own before continuing the video to consider my ideas. So, grab your pen, press pause. The video will resume in 5 seconds' time. Question 1. Compare and contrast the characters of Lucio and Claudio in this scene. Use quotations to help ensure your comments are detailed and insightful. In my summary of the scene, I describe Lucio as a bit of a joker. Whilst not contradicting this, Rachel Redford, in her essay, A Fellow of Much Licence, an interpretation of the character of Lucio, described him as a determined, irritating truth utterer. To what extent do we agree with that in relation to this scene? Well, a preference for straightforward honesty is implied through the lines on screen, which draw attention to the hypocrisy of a supposedly pious pirate having the 10 Commandments as a figurehead on his ship, and yet having to steal as part of their raison d'être. Another type of honesty is seen when he sees Mistress Overdone, the manager of the brothel, and declares that he is paid for sexually transmitted diseases within her establishment on numerous occasions. So early impressions of Lucio are that he, and perhaps the majority of men in Vienna, although not Angelo of course, is perfectly comfortable joking about sex and his own sexual desires. He feels no need to disguise his socially and morally dubious pastimes. The naturalness of his own sexual desires is implied through the nickname he gives Mistress Overdone. She is someone who, through her business, helps partially quench thunderous desires for sexual enjoyment. Pauline Kiernan, within her dreadful book Filthy Shakespeare, suggests that Lucio's language can be interpreted even more lewdly. I shall leave this on screen for a few moments so that you can sigh and tut at the unnecessary simplification and reduction of Shakespeare's language. So, in Act 1, Scene 2, Lucio is a man who seems comfortable with his role and position with his friends and within the city. As Rachel Redford writes in her essay, he is relaxed and quick-witted when exchanging lewd puns. In contrast, of course, Claudio is troubled and contemplative. His opening line suggests that he feels humiliated by his arrest and simply wants to get out of the public view as quickly as possible. In David Thacker's amusing 1994 TV interpretation, he has a particular motivation for this. Namely, he has been stripped naked within a room within the police station. Here you can see his somewhat frazzled face as the police officer puts on rubber gloves before, extraordinarily, shoving a hand up his backside. This is not shown on camera, of course, presumably to check that there aren't any drugs hidden up that particular passage. Whilst this moment is certainly attention-grabbing and imaginative, I think it unhelpfully removes some of the dignity which Claudio displays in this scene, in spite of the degrading circumstances. Rather than whinge and moan, he reflects more widely on the nature of authority. Whereas Lucio litters his exchanges with puns about sexual diseases, when asked to specify the amount of money he has spent on prostitutes, he adds a French crown more to the figure suggested, with this being both the value of a coin and a bald head, thought to be a consequence of the treatment for syphilis. Claudio's situation and perhaps character leads him to philosophize. Note that the reference to demigod would not necessarily be sarcastic within Shakespeare's time, although I would imagine that it would be tempting for a modern production to adapt this tone. Remember that kings were seen as God's deputies on earth, with a divine right to rule. Thus this phrase can potentially just be seen as a statement of fact about the great authority held by those in power. Claudio's arrest has led him to conclude that some people, including himself, will have to pay to heavenly justice for their faults. On whom it will, whereas other fault committers will be able to carry on their lives as normal. On whom it will not, so. However, crucially, Claudio accepts this seemingly arbitrary dispensing of justice. He accepts that what he has done is wrong, and therefore he cannot unduly resent being punished for it. Yet still 'tis just. So this is an impressive opening from Claudio. He seems reflective and mature, and when he goes on to reveal that he was married and all but named to Juliet when he got her pregnant, the audience is likely to feel that Angelo may have blundered in his choice of first victim to plunge his spur into in order to set an example for others. The only reason the two are not married is that they wanted to ensure her friends or relatives fully accepted their relationship first, and thus were prepared to release a helpfully generous dowry. Even before Claudio entered, the sense is that he might make a reliable friend and partner. Lucio suspects that Mistress Overdone may be correct in suggesting Claudio has been arrested because he is normally so reliable when it comes to their meetings. So if Claudio is precise in promise-keeping with his friends, perhaps he's likely to be the same when it comes to bigger promises, such as completing the final formal steps to make Juliet his wife. But it would be wrong to suggest that Lucio comes across only as a startling statement utterer and a lewd pun lover. He is also capable of helpful, fast-moving action, seen in 2 occasions in Act 1, Scene 2. Firstly, when he takes the initiative with the 2 gentlemen to head off to find news about what has happened to Claudio. And secondly, when he agrees to Claudio's plea to hunt out Isabella and get her to intercede on his behalf. Yes, he can't resist a lewd metaphorical reference to the act of sexual intercourse. Tic-tac was a version of backgammon in which pegs were placed into holes within the board, yet he is agreeing to perform an invaluable service for his friend, without which this friend is highly likely to die. He is giving dear Claudio some hope.
Question 2. What impression do you get of Vienna from this scene? Well, clearly the impression of Vienna will vary from production to production. The David Thacker 1994 TV version I referred to earlier in this video chose to include plenty of footage from a brothel steaming with alcohol and cleavage, which is smashed up by police in the middle of the scene.
Within the still shot on screen, you can see Mistress Overdone in despair, listing the reason for her worrying lack of business, whilst in front of her one of her girls vomits. At the very back of the shot, another girl is gyrating and stripping. No wonder Angelo has decreed that this brothel and others in the suburbs should be pulled down and put out of business. Within this still shot, you can just about make out the police bursting in with truncheons within the grimy, sordid darkness. Whilst in this shot, you get a sense of the chaos caused by the raid. One half-dressed blonde prostitute looks particularly distressed. Even before the characters have uttered any lines, the impression of Vienna in this production is that it may be a sordid, grubby place in which vice has got out of control. There will always be more license and opportunities to influence via setting choices within a film compared to a play, especially one staged at the Globe, which aims to use sets, costumes and music faithful to the original periods. Here you can see a still shot from their 2016 production. Lucio is camping around on the far right of the stage, whilst one of the gentlemen at the front looks particularly bedraggled and almost seems not to be wearing trousers. But the set itself is unmistakably the Globe rather than a particularly horrific, dissolute Vienna, and so the language needs to do the work. Well, if we judge by the casualness and frequency of references to sexual diseases, casual sex and prostitution would appear to be rife in Vienna. Within the lines on screen, Lucio retorts to the first gentleman that they are not as similar as he is alluding. He, Lucio, is the gentleman, as signified by the rich, luxurious cloth of velvet, whereas the first gentleman is the list, the scrap edge of a piece of cloth, and so a far more ordinary so-and-so. The gentleman is not downcast by the witty put-down, and instead develops the references to materials to suggest that it is much better to be an ordinary, healthy English gentleman, as signified by the reference to plain cloth originally made in Kersey in Suffolk, than being someone riddled with piles and syphilis, as implied through the reference to French velvet, and pilled, which means deprived of hair, a frequent side effect following treatment for syphilis. Syphilis was known as the French disease because it was spread by French troops returning from Italy. Jokes about sexual diseases are not just reserved for the men. The first charming words addressed to Mistress Overdone when she enters relate to sciatica, not just terrible back pain, but also believed to be a symptom of syphilis. So in Act 1, Scene 2, do we sense that Vienna is utterly out of control and degenerate? Well, it's not as simple as that. Yes, there are countless references to sex and sexual diseases. Another one is seen when Mistress Overdone's servant Pompey uses the euphemistic phrase groping for trouts in a peculiar river to misleadingly imply that Claudio has been sexually underhand and furtive, whereas actually his sex with Juliet was not just mutual, but by all accounts enjoyable for both parties. This Vienna also seems a world in which its inhabitants can be humane and thoughtful. The Provost seems keen to personally disassociate himself from Claudio's arrest. Yes, he needs to take him to prison, but he will make damn sure that he names Angelo as the person who has issued the instructions. Putting to one side the ludicrous bum plunging in David Thacker's 1994 TV version, the implication of this line, and the fact he gives Claudio time to complete a full conversation with Lucio, is likely to be that he feels Claudio's arrest is harsh and unjust. Within the lines on screen, note also that Joker Lucio's impulsive compassion, as he declares that he would allow Claudio not 1 but 100 words with him if he felt they might help him in any way. However, it is Claudio himself who reveals explicitly that the laws in Vienna have been left to fester and have not been implemented consistently for a number of years. 19 to be precise. The penalties for certain actions, including sex outside marriage, have been metaphorically hanging on the wall, unused like dirty armour for 19 zodiac courses, unenacted and ignored. Yet the new man has decided to start using them again, presumably to make a name for himself as the man who ensured Vienna was cleaned up and that justice was implemented. So the overall impression of Vienna must be that it has been allowed to become a city of loose morals and depravity, presumably due to the Duke's lax leadership and participation in the immorality, if Lucio is to be believed. Yet within the early scenes of the play, there are signs that its inhabitants may be fundamentally decent, kind and thoughtful human beings.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, beseeching you to think a little bit more carefully about Act 1, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. Many thanks for watching.